Hey guys, how's it going? It's been a little while. Today, I think I got something pretty special. I managed to get my hands on an old vintage suitcase, and the goal is that we're going to make a functional, portable drum kit out of it. Now I know it looks pretty old, but the important thing is that this suitcase is very strong and rigid, which will be a perfect base for the mounting hardware later on. This particular suitcase is made out of polypropylene, which is both strong, rigid, and lightweight. The most important thing though is this suitcase sounds nice when struck with a bass drum pedal, which was my goal all along. I probably spent the better part of a month going to all the charity shops and secondhand thrift stores in my area looking for a suitcase that sounded good. The second thing we're going to need is a sacrificial drum kit. The quality of the wood isn't so important, but we're going to be using almost all of the hardware. Even though kits like this one aren't very good sounding, it still has good spurs, lugs, mounts, tension rods, hoops, and even legs that we can use. And that's the most important thing, because it's the hardware that we're going to be cannibalizing in order to build our drum kit. First, we need to disassemble everything. I want everything from this kit to be able to fit inside the suitcase when we're finished. So in order to facilitate that, I'm going to be cutting these toms down a little bit. This will serve two purposes. One, it will help make the whole kit a little bit lighter and more portable. And two, it'll help make these shells a little easier to fit inside the suitcase. The suitcase itself only has about 8 inches of internal depth, so we want to try and make these toms as shallow as possible. Before we can cut anything, all these lugs gotta come off. Once everything is disassembled, there won't be anything in our way for the cutting we're going to be doing later on. Thinking about this drum kit, I decided I wanted to use the 10-inch tom as a high tom and actually use the snare drum as a makeshift floor tom. Seeing as the original floor tom was 16 inches in diameter and wouldn't fit inside the suitcase. The pros of using the snare is that it's already quite shallow, which means we won't have to cut off that much. It already has an internal muffler, and at 14 inches in diameter, we still get a pretty decent low pitch from the drum head. The most important thing now is to make sure absolutely everything is off the drums before we go over to the table saw, because any foreign material left behind, such as metal or plastic, runs the risk of getting caught in the blade. That can damage the blade, or in the worst case scenario, cause a kickback, and we don't want that. I prefer to keep all my appendages intact. So let's just make sure everything's off the drums, shall we? Here, I'm removing the vent hole with a countersink bit, an old favorite of fellow YouTuber David R. Or is it just pronounced David, who taught me this trick, and he uses it all the time. If you haven't seen his channel before, I highly recommend you give him a visit. He even made another suitcase kit right before I finished this one, which actually motivated me to finish this video, so thanks David. The cheap wrap was really easy to pull off. All I needed to do was lift the seam, and the weak double-sided tape gave away with no problem. I thought I would maybe have to use a heat gun, which is normal procedure, but in this case it was done with very little effort. All I had to do was scrape off the tape excess and smooth the exterior of the shells with my orbital sander. Meanwhile, while I was disassembling everything, I started to think about where I wanted to put my lugs. I wanted the toms a little shallower so I could stash them inside the suitcase, and that meant the lugs would have to be moved too. I couldn't make the toms too shallow, or else I might run the risk of there not being enough room to mount the hardware onto the shell properly. So I decided to place the lugs so that I had about 1 inch of space between the top of the lug and the base of the hoops. This way I still had plenty of room to tension down and tune high without running the risk of the hoop bottoming out on top of the lugs. In the end, I settled on a tom depth of a little over 3 inches from the bearing edge. I found this was barely deep enough to accommodate all the hardware, while still keeping the weight to a minimum. The wrap was also a piece of cake to remove. Wedge scraper, pull, sand, and done. Drilling new holes for the drums was way easier than I thought. I figured I could just use the old lug holes as a template and line up a 4 square to keep things nice and straight. After that, it was just a matter of measuring twice, marking it up, and drilling some new holes. I measured the mounting screw distance on the underside of the lug, and I was good to go. About 1.5 inches in this case. Also, using a makeshift pilot hole helps keep your drill holes true and on target. Once all that was done, I went over to the table saw. I cut the toms very slowly as I didn't want to make any mistakes. I took my time and made several small cuts. Once finished, I sanded the edge with the sanding block to even everything out and to make sure there were no burrs. In retrospect, I probably shouldn't have cut the toms this way. What I should have done is built a jig and rotated them over the saw blade. I didn't have a jig or the know-how when I did these cuts, but it would have made them much cleaner and would have made the cuts way more level. Oh well, I guess you live and you learn, right? This side's going to be covered up anyway, so it didn't really end up mattering much. After checking the lug spacing, everything is looking good so far. As with the lugs, I also had to make sure there was enough room for the mounting hardware so that I could mount the tom onto the suitcase. Luckily for me, the mounting arm would not take up all that much more room than the lugs, and after all was said and done, it fit just fine. As long as it wasn't in the way of the hoop and held the tom securely, there wasn't much to worry about. As you can see here, the lowest hole on the tom arm mount was the most nerve-wracking. It was so close to the edge, I worried that if I was off even by just a little bit, I might reach the lower edge of the shell. I sanded each side of the drill hole to clean it up a bit and make sure there was good, easy clearance for the screws later on. As for the middle hole for the tom arm post, it was cut with a circular saw bit. It didn't need to be super precise. I just lined it up with the center of the hole and that was that. Here's the snare drum shell on the table saw. Again, I experimented with a kind of push and pull technique, thinking it would be safe. I don't actually think this was all that safe, so do as I say and not as I do. In order to mount the soon-to-be floor tom onto the suitcase, I would need to be creative since both the single tom arm mounts were going to be used for other things, and I didn't have anything left over for the floor tom. The solution I came up with was to use 2 old floor tom leg mounts and a section of floor tom leg to hang the snare shell off the side of the suitcase. But we'll come back to that a little bit later, and you'll see what I mean. Back to the sacrificial drum set, it's time to rip off all the hardware we're going to need in order to turn the suitcase into a new bass drum. Now on to drilling holes into the polypropylene itself. After a quick sound check to find the best sounding side, I started to plan around this side as a playing surface and mounted everything else around it. I started by laying out and drilling the holes to mount the bass drum spurs. Once drilled, we could proceed with the transplant of cannibalized hardware. Back on the workbench, it's time to put these spurs on. Everything already had its own set of washers and screws, which is another reason using a sacrificial drum set makes this so easy. No extra parts or cubby diving at the local hardware store required. If you wanted, you could of course outsource all your hardware separately, but for something like this, I feel like you start to get diminishing returns past having something functional. But of course, that's up to you. You are, after all, the ace of your suitcase, or if you prefer, the Brad Pitt of your suitcase kit. Here you see me make a mistake. This type of spur holds the bass drum leg at an angle between the drum and the floor, which catches onto the carpet or wood to stop the bass drum moving around too much. However, I ended up mounting these a little too low on the suitcase. Because of this, the angle between the legs and the floor ended up being a little shallow, making it hard for the suitcase to get a grip on smoother floors. If I were to do this again, I would mount the legs higher up on the suitcase walls and maybe even mount them to the front of the suitcase for better support. Maybe we'll fix this someday with some better legs, but for now, this will do. Next, we need to find out how to attach a bass drum pedal. After looking at some other suitcase kit builds and scouring the internet forums on the subject, the consensus was that a door hinge seems to be the best in these situations, and I just so happened to have one laying around. Here I'm making sure the pedal is in the correct position. After a couple of test smacks, I found an ideal placement for the hinge so that it wouldn't be in the way and work well. Here I'm marking the middle of the suitcase and then using a foursquare to create a nice solid line for reference. Luckily for me, the door hinge I got has a center hole in the middle of the plate, so once I have that hole drilled, the other two will be no problem. I just had to measure, line it up, and make sure the hinge was flush with the outer edge of the suitcase so that the drum pedal had enough material to grab onto. I used some pretty thick bolts to hold the hinge in place. Unfortunately though, the bolts were really short and stubby, so I actually couldn't fit any washers. I don't think this was a really big deal, but maybe at some point later down the road I might replace them, but for now they'll do just fine. And with the hinge in place, we have the most bare bones, bare minimum suitcase bass drum for now. If I were so inclined, and maybe some of you are out there, you could totally stop here and have a great functioning bass drum for your needs. This is probably good for like a guitarist or something that just wants a stomp box or a bass drum and nothing else. However, in my case, I'm going to be a little extra. Next step was to plan and map out where all the toms were going to be on the suitcase. I had to sit down for a while and think about playing position. Eventually I decided that I would be mounting the floor tom off the right side of the suitcase, and then use the old double-arm tom mount on top and center on the far side of the suitcase to facilitate the high tom. I made sure to orient it so that all the wing screws were easily accessible. Once planned and mapped, it was the same old, drill and drill, and drill some more. The next day in the workshop, it was time to finish the toms. This is all a matter of personal preference, but in my case, I just so happened to have a little bit of this turquoise sparkly glitter drum wrap left over from another project that ended up failing. This was a single sheet of wrap designed for a snare drum, about 7 inches deep, and after looking at it and the color of the suitcase, I decided that, hey, this would work great. Or at least it would be better than leaving the toms au naturel. Unfortunately, I don't know what happened to the footage of me wrapping these toms. All I did though was follow the same procedure as I usually do with wrapping any other tom, using double-sided tape on the underside of the seam method. I bought this drum wrap from Wallapus.com, and overall, I was very happy with the quality and the sparkle. It was very durable and snazzy looking, and I really couldn't be happier with the end result. If you're curious about the way I wrap these drums, and you want to know more, Wallapus actually has a video showing you exactly the method I used on their website. I'll leave a link in the description below if you're interested. With all that done, all I needed to do was slap the hardware back on, put on some temporary heads, and bask in the dopamine rush while I took some contractually obligated pictures of my handiwork. The drum heads were some scrap heads I had laying around, but as you'll see, I ended up switching them out for some Aquarians later on. So here we are, that's the 10-inch tom on, and ready to play. We just got one more tom to affix, and this drum set suitcase thing will be one step closer to being ready to play. I ended up getting creative with these floor tom legs. I had a leftover backing plate from another tom arm mount that just so happened to have the same exact hole spacing as a floor tom leg mount. Using that as a template, I mounted that to the inside of the suitcase to provide a little extra stability, hoping that that extra hole might give me some marginal, or maybe at the very least psychological, reassurance. Rinse and repeat, map, drill, and screw together. You know the drill. With the floor tom leg mount attached, all I had to do was slice off a section of floor tom leg so I could attach the two mounts together and hang the floor tom off the side of the suitcase. Here, I'm just going to the drill press, since I got a vice grip there. I used a metal saw to cut the floor tom leg to the appropriate size. It took a couple minutes, but in the end it came off smooth as butter. I said smooth as butter. Smooth as butter? Butter. Oh, okay, there we go. Make sure when cutting steel like this that you file off and smooth your leftover edges. You don't want to accidentally cut yourself on these and end up having to get a tetanus shot. Last but not least, I had to make sure I could mount some cymbals onto the suitcase. I wanted it to be an all-in-one solution, as I said earlier, where I can just easily carry the suitcase around and not have to worry about stands or anything like that. I got some trashy stands with the beginner drum kit, and I figured this would work perfect. After a little bit of sawing, drilling, and tender love, I managed to free the central tube from the legs and make it fit inside the receiving hole of one of the tom arm mounts. I mounted this one to the left of the double arm mount that we put on earlier. After that was done, I just needed to put the upper pipe back onto the cymbal stand. However, we're not quite done, because for some reason the cymbal thread on this particular stand was super duper short. Maybe it broke off at some point? I digress. It was kind of a weird design, and as of right now, we can't really use it. So, once again, I had to get creative. One old carriage bolt and the right size thread, some washers, nuts, and a wing nut later, I managed to MacGyver my way into a new functional cymbal mount. As an added bonus, I used a bolt that was extra long, should I ever need to want to use a cymbal stack or something like that later down the road. Alright, with that out of the way, we got a couple of things left to do before this thing's ready to play. As you probably noticed, I got my hands on another cymbal arm mount made for an electronic drum kit. This was so I could play a ride cymbal mounted to the other hole in the double tom arm mount. The very last thing I wanted to do was make a little percussion mount, and since I had one extra floor tom leg mount left over and plenty of material from the other two remaining legs, I decided to say screw it and just go for it. All I had to do was cut up another section of floor tom leg and then heat up the steel with a blowtorch until it was soft enough to be bent to a 90-degree angle. This way, I could mount things like cowbells, wood blocks, or anything else I might feel like playing. You know what they say?
I got a fever, and the only prescription is more cowbell.
After all that, all I needed to do was pack it up and ship it off to our new home in Ireland. Unfortunately, I lost all the footage of me packing this up as well, so in lieu of that, here is a realistic, dramatic recreation. A couple weeks later, it arrived safe and sound in Ireland, with all the toms, hardware, and everything else I would need to play safely inside the suitcase. I didn't actually ship my cymbals or my snare drum via the mail, I took them with me as hand baggage, so feel free to deduct any swagger points for that transgression. So without further ado, let's crack open this baby and set her up. Alright, here she is. As you can see, I decided to add some flair by decorating the bass drum with a ton of stickers from my old home, as an homage to all my friends, the places I've played at, and the good times I had. I think the suitcase kit turned out looking pretty good. Once I got the kit, I bought a cheap little dolly, a small cymbal bag, and some baggage bungees, which made it possible for me to carry it around town without too many issues. This kept me afloat in Ireland where space was limited and allowed me to even ride on the bus into town so I could play gigs on short notice, and even set it up on the sidewalk and bus. The real joy of this kit is that it's just super easy to set up and tear down. As you can see here, everything fits inside the suitcase except my snare and my cymbals. I could in theory buy a tiny 10-inch snare drum and a cheap set of cymbals that I didn't care too much about, and then everything would fit inside there as well. But for me personally, I prefer to keep these in their respective cases so they don't get damaged bouncing around unprotected inside that suitcase. Setup and teardown only takes like 5 minutes. But enough talking, let's hear how this sounds. To the studio!
Hey man, how's it going?
Hey dude, nothing much. How's it going with you?
Yeah, not too bad. Kind of wiped from this fucking killer diet I'm on at the moment.
Oh dude, listen, do you think you can help me out with the demo track? I got this new drum kit and I need a song to show what it sounds like. You got any ideas?
Nothing at the moment. Maybe leave it with me, I'll see what I can do.
Alright, sounds good.
Cool.
Alright, bye. Bye.
I'm going on a diet, baby. I'm going on a diet. I'm going on a diet, baby. I'm going on a diet. Talk about less carbs, less fat, more lettuce and less chocolate on my diet. Ooh, I'm talking about my diet, yeah. Cause when it comes to the summertime, my abs are gonna look so sublime. Cause of my diet. I'm talking about my diet, yeah. And then the big moment comes. I'm on a beach in Costa Rica. I take off my towel and all the ladies see the results of my diet. Oh, give me some of that keto stuff. I'm talking about low-fat mayonnaise. So when it comes to the summertime, my ass is gonna look so sublime 'cause I'm a diet.
Alright, that about wraps it up. Thanks for watching, guys. I think this project ended up working out really well, and funnily enough, it ended up being perfectly timed for Halloween. So, happy Halloween if that's what you're into. Huge thanks to Stephen Brennan over on Stephen Brennan Music. Definitely check out his YouTube channel and his Instagram for tons of new music that he posts on the regular. He's a great guy and a good friend, so please consider helping him gain more views and followers because he's super hardworking and really talented. Last but not least, if you liked what you saw, please feel free to like and subscribe if you feel I deserved it. Thanks for watching, and sorry for the huge delay since last time. Hopefully the next video won't take that long. Alright guys, see ya!